Okay, this is David Zierler, Director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It's Friday, September 16th, 2022. I'm very happy to be here with Professor Alan Husker. Alan, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Alan, to start, would you please tell me your title and affiliation here at Caltech?
Yeah, my name is Alan Husker, and I'm a research professor in the seismological laboratory. I'm also the manager of the Southern California Seismic Network and the Southern California Earthquake Data Center.
Now, the network and the data center, are those Caltech projects or are those bigger affiliations?
A little bit of both. So it's a joint. The data center is purely Caltech. The network is a joint project with the USGS. And so the USGS has an office in Pasadena. It's just right across the street from Caltech.
Now, these dual affiliations, did you come to Caltech with all of them in place? Was it sort of part of a package deal, or you took on some responsibilities later on?
No, so actually I've only joined Caltech in the last year and a half, and I was replacing A.L. Hoxton, who was the previous manager of the network and the data center.
Tell me a little bit about your overall interest, the kinds of things that you've worked on in seismology.
So I'm probably one of the seismologists that's all over the place, kind of more probably than anybody else in the department. In fact, Mike Gurnis was asking me the other day, what do I do? Because it's kind of everything. But it's observational seismology, so at least that narrows it down. But I guess the easiest way to describe it is to kind of explain where I started. So my research started off primarily, well, this is where it started, but the starting point for everything I'm about to say was looking at tremor and slow slip. In the early 2000s is when they first found out there was something called slow earthquakes, or when scientists found this out, first discovered them. And so that was kind of my interest spawned shortly after that. So the slow earthquakes have tremor associated with them. So a slow earthquake could be just like a regular earthquake, but instead a magnitude 7 earthquake, say, normally lasts for about 20 seconds, the duration of the rupture, like how long it takes for the rupture to occur. In my case, but in the case of it being slow, it could be months for that same rupture. So it's just really slow. That rupture takes a really long time to propagate across that full fault trace. So if it's many months, it's slow. So it doesn't trigger the normal waves. So the seismic waves don't come out of it, so it's not as dangerous. And so my interest kind of started there, and the tremor associated with it. So as it's moving, it kind of vibrates as it's moving very slowly and creates this kind of low vibration that's called tremor. And so you can see the tremor on seismometers, and the slower rupture, you can see it kind of with the same techniques we use to study tectonic movement. So it's just really slow. So I started there, and then I started looking at the tremors, and the tremors are really interesting. And there's a lot, you need to have developed kind of different techniques for detecting them. And so some of those techniques are called, well, I don't know how specific to get into the science of the techniques.
This is what we're here for, as deep and technical as you want to go so that you can convey the point.
Okay, so, well, they're called cross-correlation techniques, but basically you see the waveform moving, and so if you have two different parts of a waveform that look similar to another part of the waveform, you can compare them. And so it's just comparing the waves from different parts of the waveform to see if you can find similarities, and then that similarity you can use to locate it. And so they found little signals within the tremor called low-frequency earthquakes. Basically, it's just tiny earthquakes that are occurring kind of inside the tremor. And then we realized that these tiny earthquakes, if you add them all up, it creates pretty much kind of the whole tremor episode. But the point is that you can find these like point sources and use that to kind of locate where it's coming from, because otherwise it's kind of difficult to find. So there's these techniques that we started off looking at for these like kind of small positions of like where it's located. And it turns out we can use these to find lots of things. So another professor in the department of Caltech here had a paper where he found like 1 billion of using the same technique, found 1 billion new earthquakes in Southern California that nobody had noticed before. We had done the same thing previously, like looking for the tremor sources with some other colleagues. This is when I was, yeah. So this is where I kind of spawned the interest. But then this technique is really powerful, so you can use it in different places. So then from there, I started exploring other places to use this, detecting just kind of earthquakes in general. And then also, I had always kind of had an interest in planetary seismology. And so one of the ideas at the time was that the Europa mission, they were going to send a mission to Europa and try to land a seismometer on there that's since been kind of scrapped. But in order to develop kind of the techniques that might be feasible for detecting ice quakes on Europa, we looked to floating ice in the Arctic. And so Norwegians had put out arrays on the floating ice in the Arctic many years ago, and around 2010. Well, a series of them around that time. But the data's free on the web, so all scientists or most seismologists will kind of, after they're done with an experiment, put this data in a kind of a repository that everybody can have access to. So nobody had looked at the data in a long time, so we downloaded it and tried to run these techniques on it. It looks like it was really promising. And then machine learning kind of came along. And so then I said, oh, this is perfect. So we then applied machine learning to it and found that you could detect the ice quakes really well. And so that was kind of an interesting technique. And so I started working with this postdoc who had come from NASA and was also using the same machine learning code for moonquakes. And so then I kind of branched out and worked with him to do the work. He was using the same code for moonquakes, for ice quakes, and then it turns out ocean bottom seismometers have a lot of noise as well. And so you have kind of these noisy sources. And so how do we detect the quakes in it? And so this technique was also really useful for detecting earthquakes on the ocean bottom seismometers. And so it's kind of like the same detection technique across all these different sources. So that was kind of like one area of my research. Another area, like I said, I started with slow earthquakes. In order to measure the slow earthquakes, I kind of mentioned there's two different things. Like there's a tremor and a slow earthquake that kind of happen at the same time. So the tremor is measured with seismometers because it's a vibration that's happening, and then the earthquake movement is so slow that it requires a GPS to measure it. And so we have these networks of GPS sensors that normally measure tectonic movement. And the slow earthquake is faster than tectonic movement. So tectonic movement is about the speed at which your fingernails grow. But this is a little bit faster than that. So we can still use these to measure the slow earthquakes. The problem is, so in Mexico, I used to work in Mexico. They have the largest slow earthquakes in the world. They're about magnitude 7 or 7.5 earthquake that happens every 4 years, every 3 to 4 years roughly. And so the question was that taking up a lot of the slip that would normally happen at the interface? So instead of having a really large regular earthquake that causes damage, do you have these slow earthquakes kind of happening? And it seems to be that that's really the case, that these slow earthquakes are happening. And so a couple different things there. One is the slow earthquakes themselves. How do you measure them? Because it's at this, it can happen over months. Then you get close to the cycle of weather. So a really common problem that can happen in data analysis is you might have another source of noise in the data, and you have to look at something that's kind of on the order of the same frequency. And so weather has an annual cycle, or it could be a 6-month cycle because of rains and things. And so in Mexico, they have a really strong rainy season, and it turns out the rainy season actually deflects the ground up and down. And so that signal is getting mixed in with the slow earthquake cycle. And so that was an interesting thing to kind of look at. But then I started looking at, you can see measure the rain almost with the same techniques. And so it's an interesting kind of spawning of different ideas, all from this initial looking at slow earthquakes. And the other thing that kind of came out of it was interest in studying two other things that came out of that. One is the statistics. So there's a lot of seismologists study the earthquake cycle. And so that's you have a buildup of earthquake of stress over time where two plates are pushing against each other, and then it releases in an earthquake. This idea. And so many years ago, some different scientists, they come up with something called the gap theory in the seismic cycle. So the idea is that if you haven't had an earthquake in a very long time in one place, you should have that should be the most probable place for a future earthquake, and you're building up energy and whatnot. So it turns out somebody in the 1970s or 1973, somebody wrote a paper. They basically said around the Pacific Rim, what are the different places? What are the gaps? And so they said these are the most likely places to have an earthquake in the future. And then 10 and then 20 years later, somebody went back and analyzed that to see if that was the case. And it turns out it didn't work at all. But it means we can't predict earthquakes, right? So it wasn't that surprising in some sense. Some people weren't surprised and other people were very surprised. But nonetheless, this kind of gap theory persisted. And so in Tokyo, they have something called the Tokai Gap. And they said that this is the most likely place for an earthquake. And this is, the big one's going to happen. And then it turns out it didn't happen there at all. There was the mega earthquake that happened in Tohoku that was nowhere near this. And so it was just kind of a showing that, that it didn't work, trying to predict earthquakes this way. And so the same thing happened in Mexico. So there's kind of different repetition of the same thing. And there's something called the Guerrero Gap, where these earthquakes, they said it was most probable place for an earthquake in the future. But it turns out the slow earthquakes are happening there every 3 to 4 years. And so part of my research was trying to understand why is it happening there? What's going on? What's the particular reason that these slow earthquakes are happening there? And it seems like they're eating up all the slip. So instead of having regular earthquakes, slow earthquakes are occurring. And so then I started interested in the geology. Why is it this is happening? What's the structure that's making it so slow earthquakes happen instead of kind of these regular, faster earthquakes? And so we did, I worked with some colleagues to do a magnetotelluric survey. So then I was just branching out of seismology altogether. And
what would you call the new field when you say you're branching out? Where were you going?
It's all geophysics, mm-hmm. But it's just using other techniques to kind of get at the answer. So, there's different techniques to measure structure with seismology, and typically it's done with something called tomography. It is one of the most common techniques, but it's getting really detailed now. So there's two different seismic waves. There's the P wave and the S wave are the kind of the most common body. They go through the Earth, and they can be affected by the fluid content in the Earth. So the more fluids there are, the more the P wave, the S wave will slow down. So we look at the velocities of the two waves and compare the difference. And so if the S wave is really slow compared to the P wave, then we say that there's probably fluids there. And so we look at a lot of different waves passing through a certain area from different angles, and then we can invert those and look at kind of the zones where these kind of slow S regions are compared to the P wave. And then we can infer that there's probably fluids there. But there's a number of things that could potentially make these differences in the two different wave rates. So another way to look at whether or not there's fluids is with the magnetotelluric technique I was mentioning. So it looks and you see like the electricity, or like if the Earth is conductive in certain areas or not. So high conductivity means there's probably fluids, is the idea. And so with this technique, we can kind of see zones of high conductivity in the Earth. And then sure enough, we could see kind of at the interface in the Guerrero Gap, there's high conductivity, which means it's probably fluids there at the interface that's greasing, it's lubricating basically the interface and makes it so it's less friction. So that looks like that's the answer as to why there's slow earthquakes there instead of these fast earthquakes.
Alan, if I could ask, maybe it's a very basic question, but the idea that there was a new category of earthquakes, slow earthquakes, developed, relatively recently, within the past 20 years, is that to say that these earthquakes simply went undetected, or that the seismological community simply categorized them in a different way?
They'd been undetected beforehand. It wasn't until we had really strong GPS networks all over the Earth that we could see these were happening. In fact, the first time I saw them, I was a grad student at UCLA, and I thought it was an error that as I mentioned, it's really easy to mix things up. And it was about an 11-month cycle. They were first seen in Cascadia, which is kind of the zone near Seattle, kind of runs from Oregon through Seattle and into Canada.
And
But in that zone,
was there a theoretical basis that they might exist and that instrumentation was improved and deployed in order to find it? Or was the discovery more happenstance than that?
the discovery is more happenstance. It wasn't a theoretical basis for it. It was rather that it was observational first, and then the theory came afterwards. And so when it was first seen, it's an 11-month cycle, and that's close enough to a year where, like I said, when I saw it, I was a grad student, but I thought this has got to be something that has to do with a seasonal change. It's almost a year. There's got to be something to it. And it turns out I was wrong, that it's actually is a real signal. And now it's been seen kind of all over the Earth in different areas.
So how does this contribute more broadly to the debate or, the general mainstream opinion that earthquakes are fundamentally not cyclical? Because it sounds from what you're saying is that slow earthquakes do seem to have a cycle to them.
Yeah, so they definitely do have a cycle to them. In fact, it got to the point where they have dubbed the name episodic tremor and slip in Cascadia because of their cycle that they have. They do kind of what we would have hoped that regular earthquakes do, that they have this really distinct, it's not 100%, it varies a little bit, but it is much more cyclical, I would say, than and less variable than regular earthquakes. So a regular earthquake, it might be you have 20 years or 2 years or 100 years between them on the same fault. So it can vary quite a bit.
So let me just think this out, because I have now been steeped in all of these discussions about earthquake prediction being fundamentally impossible because it's not about our observational or theoretical limitations. It's about the underlying chaos of the system whereby the Earth itself doesn't know. So the obvious question, the thought process that I'm going through here is clearly there must be some connection between slow earthquakes and large earthquakes. So if slow earthquakes, as you're saying, are cyclical, does that get us a little closer? Does it open the door just a little bit to the idea that there might be some cyclicity with large earthquakes and we simply haven't gotten there yet?
I would say that, yeah, maybe. That hasn't been connected yet. That was certainly kind of a hope, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And I should say, if you look at a single fault or a single kind of zone, the more you narrow it down to the space you're looking at, it becomes kind of more difficult to predict. If you say you want the average rate of earthquakes in California, say, that's actually doable. You can say that we've had so many earthquakes in the past within this kind of a zone, and so if you look at in the future, we're probably going to have a similar amount of earthquakes in the future. And so in that sense, it's actually more predictable. But if you try to say in a specific fault that you're going to have this many earthquakes, or when the next earthquake is going to be, then it's going to be a lot more difficult.
So would the onus be on the research? Is the starting point that you're assuming that slow earthquakes are not connected to large earthquakes and you have to demonstrate it as such? Or is the deeper assumption that it's all connected, it's all happening deep in the earth, and we just have to figure out what those connections are?
So they're definitely connected, but for whatever reason, and so I'm an observationalist. So you're probably going to talk, or you already have talked to Nadia Lapusta, who does rock mechanics. So she's the proper person to ask about what's the connection there. But just observationally, they're separate in the sense that, at least in the subduction zones, that you do have a separation from where they occur for the most part. One of the type of slow earthquakes can invade a little bit into where the kind of regular earthquake zone is, and the regular earthquakes can get a little bit into the slow earthquake zone, but they are separate physically in space. That's an excellent question. I don't really have a good answer. I don't know that there's been it's been solved yet. That's something we're thinking about, I guess, but don't have an answer quite yet.
It's always something where you always have to figure out What is it where it's simply an expression or a statement of our observational limitations, and when is it about recognizing fundamental chaos? So it's just
Yeah,
fun
yeah,
to see the outer reaches of knowledge in seismology at any
yeah.
given point. Alan, you alluded to it, but it just bears a little more explanation. What were some of the technological and computational advances that allowed for this happenstance discovery circa 2001? What was happening at that point?
The what really happened is the GPS networks were good enough uh, and well enough distributed over an area to measure this, and there'd been enough recording for enough time. Because if you have something such as an 11-year cycle, if you only see it once, then you on your signal, and basically all it is you see a line as because the plates will be converging, and so you can watch that rate over time. And suddenly they go backwards because it'd be like the equivalent of an earthquake. It is an earthquake, but a slow earthquake. And so that line regresses. It kind of goes back, and then it keeps going again. So as it goes back, that if it only happens once, you kind of question what in the world was that? There's something weird. Give me my data. You need to have that happen a couple of times. So it happened over many cycles, and then they were starting to believe it basically. So you needed to at least have 3 or 4 years of data of or perhaps more of these GPS stations working. So a full network that's completely working and having continuous data recording was what brought this about.
Ellen, I've heard Tom Heaton talk about gentle earthquakes. Is that an entirely different category, or are we just in nomenclature territory here?
That might be nomenclature. I haven't heard him speak about that specifically, so I don't know if he was referring to low magnitude earthquakes or the slow earthquakes. They're sometimes called silent earthquakes and slow earthquakes or slow slip events. Those are the kind of the 3 names I've heard. So I haven't heard the gentle one before, but it might be the same one. I'm not sure if he was referring to that.
Alan, obviously, large earthquakes, from a funding perspective, from a societal benefit perspective, they're sexy. People care about them. They affect people's lives. What are some of the inherent challenges from funding, from getting your colleagues interested in this? What are some of the challenges in terms of focusing on a topic that nobody even knew about 20 years before and don't really affect us, obviously, as far as we can tell?
Well, let me take just one step back because you kind of asked if they were completely separate, and I guess I gave the impression they are completely separate. There is a question as if the slow earthquakes can provoke a regular earthquake. It certainly happened the last or many cycles now where there's a slow earthquake occurring in Mexico because they last for months. And during that time, regular earthquakes occur, like a very large regular earthquake. So a magnitude 7 has occurred now, at least I think 4. It's been about 4 times or 4 or 5 times that a large slow slip event or slow earthquake is happening, and then an earthquake will happen. So it looks like there's some causality, like these slow earthquakes are perhaps provoking regular earthquakes.
Would that fall under the category of earthquake clustering, or this is a larger time scale than that?
It's a larger time scale than that, I think, but it's also it doesn't happen all the time. So that's the problem. Most of the time you have a slow earthquake and there's no regular earthquake. It just happens. So then there's a question does it just raise the bar a little bit? So we might have that earthquake was ready to go anyways, but then you have a slow earthquake that comes along and just nudges it a little bit more to make it happen. So that's a little unclear, but it looks like there is some causality there. And certainly the other way around too, that you can have a large earthquake that then causes a slow earthquake to occur, has also been observed. So there's both kind of both sides of that coin. So there is at least that interaction that seems to be happening between the two. But back to your question, I'm sorry.
The question about, like the inherent excitement or sexiness of large earthquakes and the challenges of dealing with an earthquake that's hard to detect and perhaps even get people excited about.
Right. So at first, actually, it was really exciting because it was brand new.
Yeah.
So that I don't think there was any, and there was a lot of questions. Excuse me, like specifically this question of, can a slow earthquake provoke a large regular earthquake, or vice versa, was unknown. It seems to be becoming a little bit clearer now, but that certainly wasn't the case at first. And so there was kind of that question. And then suddenly tremor was also detected, and then it was like, oh, they're not completely silent. In fact, I think the first paper about this was along the lines of the noise of silent slip or something to that effect. It was, kind of some clever name. And then there's different flavors of tremor then that have come out where they see these kind of, I told you about the low frequency earthquakes, which are these kind of tiny earthquakes within the signal. And then they have very low frequency earthquakes. And I don't know, just a number of things that were kind of observed at first. And so there was just 1,000 papers kind of coming out, or not 1,000, but a very large volume of number of papers that were suddenly spawned or coming out of this new field. Once they realized this was happening, then people started looking at any way they could to figure out what was going on. And then it was very quickly observed that the high pore fluid pressure that I mentioned, like fluids basically, were observed in association with these. So there was kind of like a lot of different observations that came out. And so scientists, there's a little bit of excitement, there's competition. I think competition drives a lot of people. So when you see, your colleagues suddenly writing 5 papers about something, you get interested, and I want to write 5 papers too, right? So there's the competition aspect of it. There's also a little bit of publish or perish. I mean, if you know that you can write a paper about something and get published, get that published, there's a little bit of that going on. So I think there's a lot of motivations. That it's not just how do we detect large earthquakes, or how are we going to I guess beyond seismic hazard. I think there's plenty of other reasons, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at, as motivations for people to study this. I mean, just the fact that it was something new, I think it made it kind of the big thing. So after this, I would just say in general, like one of the big things that came along afterwards was the induced seismicity, like what was seen in Oklahoma, was very exciting. So if there was, it's almost like a fad in seismology. So the first one was kind of this slow slip events and slow earthquakes, and tremor was kind of a thing that lasted for a few years. Then the stuff in Oklahoma came out, and that was really exciting. And that caused a lot of interest. And now there's kind of like machine learning, that's really exciting. And now there's DAS. And actually, I was going to mention that too. It was another thing. I hadn't reached that yet, but now I'm starting to work a little bit on these, I think, now as being the manager of the seismic network. But those are kind of the big things. So there's like, I would almost see them as waves of fad, maybe is too strong a term, but interest. This is kind of new and exciting. So, a lot of papers are written, people kind of get excited about it, and then it kind of gets incorporated into the main body of seismology. And then it's just something that's part of it, as opposed to like the new exciting thing. But certainly I would say slow slip and tremor is kind of past. It's not the latest thing anymore, but that it certainly was in the early 2000s.
Alan, just a nomenclature question. Slow slip and slow earthquakes. What's the relation? What's the overlap? Where's the distinction?
They're exactly the same. It's just that one is used more with lay people and the other one is used more in between scientists. So slow slip is used more in between scientists, and slow earthquakes we use kind of like to describe it to the rest of the world.
Now, for your own career, it's always exciting, obviously, when there's a discovery that happens during graduate school, during a formative period of one's research career. Over the last 20 years, have your research interests and opportunities more or less tracked with where slow slip research has taken the field?
It did for a long time. I have to, there's a part of me that once I feel like I figure something out for the most part in my head, I kind of okay, I did that, I want to move on now. And so that was a lot of the reason why I started looking at these other things, how do I detect something that's in, ice quakes? Oh, that looks interesting. Let me go play with that now. So part of me feels like a jack of all trades, master of none at times, because I get excited about something and then I move on to the next thing. So I'm happy to kind of move and try new things. Some of my other colleagues, I think, do the deep diving, really get into a field and really, explore it really deeply. Whereas I feel like I touch on a lot of things. It's just kind of what excites me, and I want to move towards that. And if a student also is interested in something, it's easier to kind of push in that direction.
Alan, I'm curious, doing your so much research at UCLA, how did the Seismo Lab loom in your mind in terms of, its status in the field, the kinds of people that were there, the kinds of research that the Seismo Lab was known for? Where did that fit in with your overall interests in graduate school?
Caltech is, I mean, the pinnacle. It's, I mean, I still can't believe I have a job here. I mean, like,
Me too. We're in the same boat.
So it was. I mean, yeah. I mean, one of my postdocs said it best. It's like seismological royalty. You had Gutenberg and Richter and like the pioneers in the field were working here, and you see their pictures in hanging up in down the hall, and you just think, I'm not worthy, right? Like, these are the guys that started the field. So yeah, it's the biggest names, I think, and the most exciting research that's happening seem to be coming out of Caltech, certainly. I mean, not everything. I mean, like I said, there's this discovery in Cascadia that had nothing to do with Caltech, but nonetheless, I mean, you can see that their influence on so many different things.
I'm always interested in the concept of, I don't even know if it's a word, but extrapolatability, right? The idea that you're studying something locally, but you want to see if it has global ramifications, if this is something that's true across the planet. So in that vein, what have we learned about slow earthquakes if you're studying at the local level and trying to figure out how they work on a planetary basis?
That's 100% important, I would say. We want to kind of have a universal law, like, why is this working where it is working? So, when I was looking at in Mexico and trying to figure out why is this slow earthquake only happening in this one spot? Why does it repeat here every single time? Whereas with regular earthquakes, there's kind of, like I said, a jumble. If you look at one part of a fault, you don't see that repeatability in quite the same way and quite the same scale. And so why is that happening? And so the answer seems to be that there's fluids or something that are trapped in a certain area that really allow for this to happen. And so that seems to be a great explanation. And you want to see that across the globe. Then if you see it in one place, is that true? It needs to be able to be repeated in some sense. And for the most part, that seems to work. But there's those kind of like certain situations where you don't see a relationship with fluids, and you wonder what in the world's going on. And so it's not 100%. So that's interesting. Why does that occur? But yeah, you need to have kind of universal laws. Another issue that kind of comes up is just because you see a coincidence, is that causality or is that a coincidence? So as I mentioned, these slow earthquakes are happening, at least in Mexico, for many months. And then a large earthquake comes along and occurs at the same time. So did one cause the other, or is it just randomly that, an earthquake happened? So you need to see this happen over many cycles in order to get an idea that, yes, that there seems to be a higher rate of these large earthquakes happening whenever a slow slip is happening or a slow earthquake is happening. So, and then you want to think about this universally. Is the same thing happening in Japan? Is the same thing happening, in Cascadia or wherever? I think it's with everything in not just seismology, but studying the earth and geophysics. You want to be able to extrapolate and see if this is happening across the entire globe, or if you can say something more than just the area you're looking at.
Alan, tell me about your work in transform plate boundaries. I know plate boundaries, of course. What does the term transform mean that precedes plate boundaries?
So there's like a few different types of plate boundaries. There's convergent, and then there's transform. So convergent is where I was working in Mexico. That's where they're converging and pushing against each other. Transform plate boundary would be more like here in California with the San Andreas, where they're moving side by side with each other, against each other. But they're not pushing against each other. So I actually haven't worked a lot here in California. I kind of went to grad school. I did write a paper for my master's here in California, looking at side effects a long time ago, and then I went off to Mexico, and now I've come back. So I'm kind of just back to the transform region, and I've kind of been away for a while. So. My research right now is getting into that a little bit as being the head of or managing the network, but I haven't done a lot of research in that area still.
Alan, how did you get involved in nuclear verification and nuclear security issues?
Oh, okay. So that was kind of one of the cool things about the job in Mexico. So when I was working in Mexico, so I was a grad student. I went to Mexico for my research because we went and installed seismometers there, a seismic network. And then I ended up meeting my wife and falling in love and getting a job there. So then I stayed there for quite some time afterwards, after grad school. Well, I was a professor. But the UNAM, the university there, is the National Autonomous University of Mexico, is a national university. So as opposed to like in the U.S. where we typically have state universities, the national university is with the federal government. And so Mexico is a much smaller economy than the U.S., and therefore it doesn't have like all the same parts of the government kind of as the U.S. does, or have the same money. And so it works actually with the federal university to do a lot of things. So the National Seismological Service is actually run out of the federal university, as opposed to here in the U.S. we have the USGS that really kind of like runs on the national level. We have like all the state universities that have regional networks, but there's a USGS that kind of hold it all together. Whereas UNAM was actually what does that in Mexico. And because of that, they're the ones that have the contract with the CTBTO. The CTBTO is the Center for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, or the Commission for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. So they have a contract with them to run the stations that they have with CTBTO and give their data to them. And so I had experience running like a local temporary network in grad school, and they were looking for somebody to do it. And they said, "Could you do it, Alan?" I was like, "Sure, let's do it. That sounds great." So that was really where it came from.
You did this as a foreign national, I assume.
Yeah, exactly.
Were there any sensitivities? I mean, this is sensitive information. How did you deal with that?
It was a little weird. So the information is sensitive and it's not. So I mean, it's seismic data. It's kind of open to the world because you can install a seismometer, and the seismic network already opens the data. So there's data that's available for many of these stations, anyways, because they're shared typically between the local country and Vienna. What's different is. So in that sense, that wasn't a problem. Like it's not sensitive in that sense because, it's earthquakes, and so earthquakes aren't like a national secret. I mean, so what was weird though is when I would go to Vienna and I'm sitting around the table with everybody else and has Mexico sitting in front of me on my name tag, and people say, "Why in the world?" I mean, I'm at the United Nations, right, representing Mexico in some sense, and that part was a little weird, but yeah. So it was, but the other thing is the CTBTO is a huge bureaucracy, and so they have to answer kind of to all the countries that give money to the United Nations, and so they're not actually allowed to even say if there was a nuclear bomb threat or if a nuclear bomb occurred or nuclear explosion. And so what they have to do is, I mean, they can show that here's the data. Look at this here. But then countries have to individually say that there was a nuclear explosion or confirm it. The CTBTO can only provide the information, but they're legally not allowed to say it because of different countries not wanting them to. It's kind of an ironic situation to be in.
I mean, there's so many different unique vantage points that you're getting. First of all, regardless of your citizenship and representing Mexico, what did you learn more broadly about the world of nuclear verification and nuclear security in this experience?
What's interesting is, I mean, the countries that have the most don't want to be verified.
Of course.
So Russia, the U.S., China, I think Israel is one of them. I can't remember for sure. But those, India, again, none of those have signed the treaty. So the treaty won't go into force until all the countries sign, and nobody foresees that'll ever be signed. And nonetheless, the U.S. contributes, millions of dollars to have this kind of global network monitoring to see if anybody's testing nuclear weapons. So in that sense, it's kind of an ironic, again, this balance of what all the different superpowers want. And so it was interesting to see kind of how these negotiations occur. And nonetheless, since it's gone into force, the number of nuclear arms testing has just diminished completely. It's almost nothing. In the 80s, it was happening constantly. And then since this has gone into place, it's completely diminished the
What
amount of
role
nuclear
does the
testing.
end of the Cold War have in all of this, do you
Oh,
think?
it's completely. I mean, it's all tied together, right? The end of the Cold War was a huge part of it, and that's what led to this organization. So, I mean, my role in it was I would say, very tiny in general, other than just being a kind of a piece that kept at least like the Mexican stations kind of moving forward.
Is there a
So, yeah.
field of seismology that's specifically focused on delineating tremors from a nuclear explosion versus tremors that are occurring naturally?
Yes. So a nuclear explosion doesn't look like tremor; it looks more like an earthquake. In fact, you can kind of put them on the similar magnitude scale because it's just how much energy was released in that moment, or how much seismic energy you can measure. And so you can actually use, for instance, the Richter scale in order to measure the size of the explosion. But they do look quite different. So I mentioned there's P waves and S waves. So a P wave is a compressional wave. It kind of moves in and out as it's expanding away, whereas S wave is a shear wave. So it goes back and forth like this. So a bomb doesn't cause shear. And so typically a bomb really has a very strong P wave and almost no S wave, whereas from an earthquake from a fault will have a smaller P wave and a much larger S wave. And so that's the easiest way to distinguish between the two. But they're almost impossible to disguise. I mean, if anybody looks at a seismogram of the two and is a seismologist, it's very obvious to distinguish between the two. But I'm sure there's machine learning. Somebody's doing machine learning algorithms right now to classify them automatically, as opposed to having somebody to need to look at them.
Alan, did you know Spanish prior to going to Mexico, or was that some crash course that you had to take to pursue this opportunity?
No, I didn't know Spanish, and then even when I arrived, I would say I didn't really know Spanish. I mean, I knew some words, but definitely not fluid at all. I mean, I didn't speak fluidly at all. So I just learned it on the fly by the seat of my pants kind of thing. I was out in the field having to find places to install seismometers, and I had some Mexican colleagues that would basically go out with me. But they were kind of hired by UNAM, and I was the one directing, like, let's go over here and check this out. Let's try this. Let's try this. So it was kind of fumbling through Spanish and as much as I could, and then just building it up over time.
Alan, you mentioned the Richter scale before. I'm so fascinated in the relevance of keeping his name attached to the modern magnitude system, where maybe it really should be called the Kanamori scale or something else. We just call it the magnitude scale at this point. Is the Richter scale, since obviously Richter himself would not have known about slow earthquakes, are the magnitudes that the field of seismology has traditionally dealt with, are they relevant for slow earthquakes, or is it simply too small, you need a different parameter set?
So it's okay. Let me explain. So just to take a step back. So actually, I just learned recently the reason it's called the Richter scale is so Gutenberg and Richter, who are both professors at
Yes.
Caltech, actually came up with a scale. So it actually should be called the Gutenberg-Richter scale, right?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
But I only recently found out, maybe you already know, that the reason it's called the Richter scale is because the local news media, wanted to interview scientists about earthquakes, and so the person they would always interview was Richter because he had no accent. He's American, whereas Gutenberg wasn't American, and so he got the name from the news media, the Richter scale. And I only recently learned that. So that's interesting. But beyond that, the scale itself is just measuring kind of how big, it's a relative thing, how big is the seismic wave at a point at a certain distance away from a fault, or from where the source was. And so people got really used to this scale. And so all scales that have come since then kind of are associated with this scale. So even if you have, a magnitude 5 on the Richter scale, and they said the Kanamori scale, so his is MW. On the MW scale, you also have a magnitude 5. Then you know that they're really similar. So that's not on purpose. Everything was related back to the Richter scale because it was the first one, and so they're all very similar. But that way it gives, I think, people an idea of like what's going on. Now back up to the slow earthquakes. modern earthquake scales are based on the rupture size of the earthquake, and basically the dimensions of the earthquake. So it's not about how much you feel it, it's just the dimensions of the earthquake itself. So if you have a really large rupture that's, say, I don't know, 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers in width or length, and something like 50 kilometers or 20 kilometers in width, whatever it is, it means it's a very large area. So that area is really large, then the magnitude's going to be large. And so it's all associated with what that area is and how much slip occurred. And so it's the actual dimensions of the fault and how much slip was on the fault. And so that scale then works whether or not it's a slow earthquake or a regular earthquake, because in either case, all you're doing is measuring the dimensions of the fault.
Your time in Mexico, just, living among earthquakes, just on a personal level, did that influence your science in any way, just experiencing earthquakes in a society that has too much experience with earthquakes?
Yeah, it got me really interested in people's perception of earthquakes. Definitely. So towards the end, like I said, I kind of am a jack of all trades, master of none. So I got really interested in earthquake early warning. But almost, so I'm heavily involved now with earthquake early warning, from the management side of things and operations with the network. But at the time in Mexico, before I left, I started growing really interested in how do people experience it, or what is it that what do they do? How do they experience it? What's the right way what do you do if you hear an alert that's occurring? These kinds of things. And so I started to work with a postdoc who was interested in these kind of questions, the societal questions. And so now we've written a couple of papers together. But then I left Mexico, and so she's still there working on things. But so that was a whole other aspect. And so, yeah, that was definitely being in the middle of these large earthquakes and hearing the alarm go off and seeing people's reactions kind of made me think about it. That part of it, definitely.
Now, as prelude to your involvement with the Southern California Seismic Network, Southern California Earthquake Data Center, how much involvement did you have prior to these appointments in just the general field of network monitoring? What was new to you, and what did you come in with specific experience?
You mean here in California?
Correct.
Okay. So I had a lot of experience. I had done a lot of the field work to install. I don't have to do that as a manager, right? But I had done it personally, pouring concrete base and putting a seismometer down on it. All that kind of stuff out in the field, hiring people to help out. So just the installation of a seismic station in general. And also part of my research in grad school was to actually install telemetry. So we had radio sites on all the stations I installed to radio the data back to some central site. So I had that kind of again, for all the way from the field up to actually running code and logging into the different sites and making sure data was flowing. So I was doing some kind of network monitoring personally. So I had kind of very much from the ground up kind of experience. And then I was managing a team of people to go out and install equipment or to do whatever. And so my advisor kind of completely left that up to me. I just took over and started managing people right away to make the network run, because it was 100 stations and it had to run. And when things would go down, I was one in charge of basically making sure it was running. And so I would say almost immediately I was doing this with my own, just because it had to happen. I don't even know if I was assigned to it. It was just it had to happen, and I was the one doing it. So I naturally just kind of fell into the role in some ways. And then the CTPTO I was managing, but on a much higher level. So then I was looking at finances and asking the CTPTO for the next round of funding and things like this. And then also managing people that were going out to the field. And then it was also, they have stations on an island, and so we had to get permission from the military who controls the island to go and service the site, and then worry about weather. And we had a satellite connection, and so there was a new form of, it wasn't new, it was just new for me. But they've been working with us to work with satellite telemetry. So yeah, so I kind of got all levels of that in my experience there.
Alan, you mentioned, of course, Mexico is a much smaller economy. It's a poorer country than the United States. What are some of the structural limitations from a budgetary perspective working with Mexican authorities to make sure that the network is healthy, that it's doing what it's supposed to do?
So I was never, just to clarify, I was never the head of the seismological service, the entire seismological service. I only had like a very limited piece of it, which was the stations that were working with the CTBTO. From that perspective, the CTBTO was actually giving us plenty of money. So there was never an issue with funding with those specific stations. There's only 4 of them. So we actually had more than enough budget. We were doing fine. But in general, I would just say that, I mean, for my research projects, yeah, it was almost impossible to get money for research projects. And so a lot of what we do is either work with foreign countries that would come in and bring in money. So we worked a lot with Japan or France that helped us install equipment, or the CTBTO. But yeah, you look for other funding sources when you don't have the government to help to fund things.
Are there any analogs in Mexico to the USGS, the NSF, the traditional places that American researchers would go for funding support?
Yeah. There was the equivalent of the NSF is called CONOCYT. It's a very similar. I mean, it's the same idea, but just nowhere near the same level of funding. For a while, it was okay, but it was near impossible by the time I left to get any funding out of them. Each president in Mexico has a very strong control kind of over the budget. And so the most recent president just had reduced the funding to it quite a bit.
In maintaining these networks to make sure that they're working well, that they're healthy, if that's the right word, what are the metrics that you use? How do you know that they're doing what they were designed to do?
Again, good question. So there's a few different ways. So one would be station uptime, just looking at percentage of time the stations are up and running. There's also how noisy stations are. And this might change over time. So there's a station, for instance, here that's in Rancho Cucamonga, and Rancho Cucamonga has grown, and now they're they're building more kind of warehouses and things in the area. It's causing more noise, and so we look at the quality of the station and see that it's getting noisier, and so we're not thinking we're going to have to move it because the noise level's just gotten so bad. So those are kind of the 2 main ways, I would say, just looking at the quality of the signal coming in, and then the other one is the how long is it actually working for? What's the uptime?
When you were in Mexico, I wonder if you thought more broadly about the humanitarian situation in Central America, the issue of refugees and drug violence and political instability. Did you tend to look at those things through a seismological prism? Was there that aspect? Or just being a scientist around these things, it was just inescapable for you to think about them?
Yeah, more the latter. So I was out in the field. I did a lot of field work where I was just in places where you just see things, and it was just impossible to escape it. As much as you hear things on the news here, like there to actually be in places where you see it, I think is different. And you see what people are going through kind of on a day-to-day basis in some of these areas. It was at a school where you can see bullet pockmarks on the side of an elementary school. It's hard to avoid,
I'm curious if you've ever thought about like neocolonialism, things like that, tensions between developed countries and underdeveloped countries, again, through the prism of seismology. I'm thinking, for example, the controversy over the 30-meter telescope in Hawaii and its connection to, native peoples of Hawaii who are upset with the way that the astronomy community has dealt with them over the decades. Are there analogs with that as it relates to seismology and research stations?
Not in a negative way. In general, people want to know more about earthquakes. In fact, it almost made life easier for us because we could drive into kind of like narco traffic drug lord territory and like be okay, because they are people too. They want to know about earthquakes as well, and so they would see it as a way to find out about hazard as well, I think. So if anything, it was kind of more of a positive. It was, people are interested in earthquakes and want to know what's going on. And so people were very interested in it. In general, that wasn't so much. Not for seismology itself, I would say that wasn't the case. Kind of a bigger overall picture, just seeing these kind of things happening. That outside of seismology, I would say, Americans obviously buy tons of drugs, and that's why these kind of different things are happening in these areas. So it was more like being an American in these regions, I would say, more than the seismologist side of things was like what I saw. Yeah.
The fields of earthquake engineering and earthquake mitigation are obviously adjacent to your area of expertise, but being in Mexico, being in a land of unreinforced concrete and fragile infrastructure, how might that have changed your perception of these issues relative to had you been in, say, Switzerland, for example?
Probably going to answer in a way that's odd. If anything, I was surprised how often things survived. These kind of earthquakes. There's magnitude 7s on the coast that happen often enough, and you see these kind of like tiny hotels, a few stories, maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3-story talls. They survived the earthquake and they're basically sitting right on top of it. And it's always just kind of blew my mind how well they did for the number of earthquakes that were happening there. And typically, it wasn't always the case. Obviously, there was those situations that were a lot worse, but it did kind of surprise me. Instead of some of these smaller communities, and I guess I saw the infrastructure. The more complex the infrastructure, the more the potential problems. So Mexico City, for example, had a lot more damage in previous earthquakes, but it's a much more complex situation of what's going on. It's not fair just to say it's the buildings and whatnot, because Mexico City itself is on a basin, and there's a huge amplification that happens anytime a wave enters the basin. But certainly the larger the city, the more complex it is, the more things going on, the more people, the much larger the vulnerability. And so the much greater potential for disaster. But certainly the other thing I saw was that people don't follow building codes. Actually, Mexico City has really good building codes. The problem is people wouldn't always follow those building codes, and that could be because of money. It could be because of just ignorance. There's just different reasons. But there was one building that collapsed because storekeepers on the bottom floor, for example, wanted to have kind of 2 stalls next to each other, and then they broke the wall that was between the 2 of them so they could expand the size of the store. And then the building just collapsed during the earthquakes. It no longer had that support wall. Well, the person that did this obviously didn't really fully realize the importance of that wall that was there while they're trying to expand their business. So there's those kind of situations that are really sad, but so I guess that education is key in a lot of these situations.
Alan, a few questions relating to chronology, both backward-looking and forward-looking. How do you assess earthquakes that happen before the advent of seismic networks? A century or more ago, how do you think about the location and meaning of earthquakes before we had effective data to understand them?
I tend to be on the skeptical side of that. There's people who've done a lot of work trying to figure that out. And typically that's going back to older records and newspapers to try to figure out more about what that magnitude actually was at the time when it's happened and the location. But I've read some of them, at least the Mexican newspapers, and some of them are quite confusing. Even time of day will switch from one account to the next when it gets to be older. And so as a scientist who's really trying to narrow something down, it's really difficult to fully count on these records. Even here in the U.S., they have the new Madrid earthquake that happened, a couple hundred years ago. and it's supposed to be a very large earthquake, and there's been like very little seismicity since then in the same area, and it makes you wonder. There was people again who's done very good, excellent work to look at this and to try to figure out what really happened, and looking back at those accounts. And I certainly have not done that, but I at least start to get a bit more skeptical the older the earthquake as to what the location might have been and the actual true magnitude. It We'll know that it's big, but really narrowing down that number, I think, is difficult. There's going to be more variation of what that actually might be.
And to flip the direction of that timescale for the question, thinking about the future, in what ways do you consider the moment that we're in now as a future historical capsule? How can we preserve this data so that future generations will make the best use of it, that it'll simply be around, that it'll be accessible 100 years from now in terms of whatever their computers look like?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the metadata that goes into it. So the metadata is like all the description behind the data so that they can piece together, use whatever new techniques that might exist. One other interesting thing is we have an explosion of data right now, which is different. So when we're looking back and trying to piece together, what happened 100, 200 years ago, there's just very little to go on. If anything, we have just such an explosion of data right now. We're trying to come up with new techniques to these massive data analysis techniques like machine learning and whatnot. It's just, and we're even getting more now with new types of instrumentation. The challenge almost becomes how do we even preserve so much information? And to the point of like, is it even, without it getting thrown away? I know that a lot of, different temporary arrays that have been installed in the past, the tapes get thrown away. This gets kind of old information. And so how do we really preserve that is like, I think it really a fundamental question. It's going to be hard. And moving forward, I'm just seeing how much data it just isn't multiplying, and the storage we have needs to change to accommodate that, and even the techniques to analyze it. And so that's all moving forward, and it's exciting, but it is a real challenge. I don't have a good answer. I guess I'm still kind of grappling with this as well.
Is there still?
But I think just documentation, I think, is what we have to go with right now.
Is there still a role for paper and analog records? We never have to worry about, what computer system can access a book or a printed map or things like that. Is there still that role, or is there the concern that we're entirely digital now, and now it's just a matter of leapfrogging this data from one generation of systems to the next?
I'm of the mind that we need to go completely digital, and the reason is usability. All of our tools are moving to electronic tools, so the more digital you can make it, the easier it is to use. If we have it on paper, it's just less usable. There's not many people that are going back to paper records at this point. If anything, we need to scan it and make it digital so it's usable. So if we don't have it as digital, it's just going to fall by the wayside, is what I see at this point.
I want to go now for the last part of our talk, to the extent that you appreciate the history of these networks that you're managing. Tell me a little bit about, your understanding of this. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, can I take one pause really quick?
Yeah.
My wife wants something real quick. I'm at home.
Please.
Just give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
Please, go for it.
Thank you. that.
And we're back. All good?
Yeah.
All right. So the first, I want to ask about your sense of the history, first with the Southern California seismic network. So what are the institutional partnerships that allowed this network to come into being?
So it has a long history, and Ale is certainly the better. I don't know if you're interviewing him, but he's certainly the better one to know the past, the history than I am. It's gone through kind of a number of phases, but California itself has invested quite a bit. The office has gone through a couple of name changes, but currently it's CalOES, the California Office of Emergency Services, has invested quite a bit. They did that originally through the California Integrated Seismic Network is what it's called. And so that's a combination of Caltech, the USGS, and Berkeley. And the USGS has an office, I should say local USGS, not the kind of national level, but the local office in Pasadena and Menlo Park are the two. Good. I'm okay. So there's that part of it, and then there's the USGS, the federal government also gives funds. So those are the kind of the two main ones for a long time, and then earthquake early warning came along. So Caltech was actually heavily involved in the effort to lobby Congress actually for the earthquake early warning system, and so that was a lot of work from Tom Heaton and others at Caltech and also Berkeley to kind of move this forward. And now it's the entire West Coast has the earthquake early warning. And so that's a huge, actually, it now accounts for the majority of our funding comes from early warning.
And what is the institutional relationship? Obviously the Seismolab is part of Caltech, but is the Seismolab the main point of contact between the USGS as far as the SCSN is concerned? In other words, is there an independent relationship between Caltech and the network independent of the Seismolab, or it all runs through the Seismolab?
Yeah, no, the Seismolab is the umbrella above the network. So we're definitely within the Seismolab. The SCSN is purely within the Seismolab, and as well as the data center. And then we work with the USGS. But yeah, we're all underneath the umbrella of the Seismolab.
So the reporting structure, you would report to Mike Gurness, who reports to the division chair, as you would with anything else.
Yeah.
What's the overlap, and where is the distinction between SCEC, for example?
So SCEC originally, originally SCEC helped fund a lot more, and I guess they still do, but I think it's been flat funding for a while. But they were certainly, I think, very involved early on at helping the data center get started, and had a much more kind of vital role there. But as just other funding has come in that's a lot bigger, that role has kind of diminished a little bit. It's still there and it's still important, but it's just not quite the same. And so I went actually to SCEC this last week, the last few days. I just got back yesterday, and what's interesting is that everybody uses the data, and it's a fundamental role for all of the Southern California Earthquake Center, and it's actually now called the Statewide Earthquake Center, or the Statewide California Earthquake Center. But they don't. What's the word I'm looking for? There's not a lot of communication to what they want, and so it's me more as a scientist, like trying to get a feel for what the community wants, and a lot of it's driven from the science of the people at Caltech in the Seismolab. But certainly, I'm as a manager now trying to see the greater community. What are the needs, and what do people want? And so, but yeah, that level of communication maybe isn't there, and it's something I probably want to work on a little bit more.
So when you hear on Twitter or on the evening news there was a 7.7 something, where does the network play in first the detection and then the dissemination of the information?
It's kind of at all levels. So all of the data comes through us, and so there's immediate algorithms that start to detect. And so those first few seconds is when earthquake early warning will detect and make a determination of the magnitude to start to send out alerts. those algorithms were developed at Caltech by different groups. One of the most important ones was developed by actually Tom Heaton, since I mentioned him earlier, in his group, and then were implemented by computer scientists or computer engineers within the Southern California, within the SCSN, within the network. And so a lot of that actual programming was done here as well. Berkeley has their version too, that they've done a lot of the programming. So it's been kind of combined now between a lot of what Berkeley and Caltech have done. So that there's that early warning piece, and then beyond that, there's depending upon the size of the earthquake, you have to wait some time to be able to determine the magnitude. And the reason for that, I mentioned earlier, if it's a magnitude 7, it can take 20 seconds just for the rupture to propagate. So that's at the fault itself, but then the waves have to propagate out from there and reach seismic stations, and you have to be able to measure and at enough seismic stations to get an idea of what the actual earthquake was. And so the larger the earthquake, the more time you have to wait, basically. And if it's, say, a magnitude 8, you might have to wait like 20 minutes to be able to know everything about the size of the earthquake. So it really depends on that. But then all that data comes through us. But if it's above a magnitude 6, the USGS basically takes over. So our agreement is we do everything below magnitude 6 locally or regionally here in Southern California. But then if it's a larger earthquake, then that's when the USGS kind of takes over and they run the show. But they're getting all of their data from us.
As an educational institution, what are the boundary lines where Caltech has to be careful that it's not dispensing with policy advice and public safety information, where, those are the kinds of things that are best left to the government? How are those delineations made in real time, particularly when an earthquake is happening?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because, the public wants to hear from an expert, and so they want to hear from a scientist, and so they want to know what we have to say. In fact, I think we drive a lot of it. So the Cal OES will ask us for information almost immediately as well. So within 20 minutes, some piece of information that what's the size of the earthquake and whatnot. And so there's automatic systems they can get from the USGS. So they also want to know from us, where was the rupture, who's this affecting, these kind of things. We give out that information, and then the public wants to know. So I think a lot of it is our own ideas of what's appropriate. And there's kind of there's so many scientists within Southern California that are working on this, that the USGS on their side, and with us now, it's kind of almost an organic thing. Somebody will start like a Teams group and immediately add everybody, and people start throwing in information, and it's this kind of interesting way to see how science is done on the fly, that there's suddenly all the aftershocks are thrown in a map, and so people can look and analyze that, and the earthquake, the magnitude of the main shock itself, and all the information for that is thrown in, and talking points are developed, and all this just kind of comes together. It's actually kind of a really cool thing to watch. I've been through it for a very large earthquake, but there was a magnitude 4.4 some time ago that I was here for, and watched it all come together. So it's just interesting that there's so many minds kind of working on this, that the talking points kind of generate themselves, and people seem to adhere to it for the most part. We don't have anybody that goes off and says something crazy. Yeah.
Now, as manager, do you directly liaise with the mayor, the governor, the policy organizations, or does that all happen through the survey?
That happens through the survey. We don't have any direct, that kind of level of communication. We do have, so yes and no. So Cal OES, there's kind of an interesting relationship between Cal OES and the federal government. So Cal OES a lot of times prefers to work with us or with Berkeley. Then they do want to do with the USGS because there's kind of some tension between government agencies sometimes. So we'll tell them the information, but they could easily get it from USGS as well.
Now, just so I understand the nuances, the data center, the Southern California Earthquake Data Center, that's simply the archive of the network. Does it have a different or separate function?
That's the primary function. do, so if a professor, typically these are Caltech professors, but it could be, I mean, somebody outside of Caltech could analyze that data, and then we'd put that analysis on the web also. So for example, we have the archive of the data, the original waveforms from all the stations that are coming, and we save that. We also locate earthquakes at the magnitude and have it make a catalog, and we save that catalog as well, which is a product kind of the data. But other people, so like Zach Ross, I mentioned, had made his own catalog. So we archive that as well, and they make that available to the public as well, that he used with a machine learning picker. And then we also use DAS as a new technology I kind of mentioned a couple times, but maybe we can get into that some other time. But that's like John Wynn's field. But he and I are certainly like interested in working on making this part of the network as well, which is distributed acoustic fiber, but using basically the telecom fibers that are laid, turning those into seismometers. And that's a whole other large amount of data. And so we have now in the data center some of this fiber, but this is coming from one of John Wynn's experiments. But now we're hosting it on the website. And so I would say the majority of it comes from the data center. It is the archive for the network, but we do have kind of like specific data from other areas that we put on there too.
Alan, the last topic I want to touch on for today's talk is just your balance of responsibilities at Caltech with all of the things that you're doing. So on a given week, between managing the network and the archive and being a research professor, is it all sort of jumbled together? Is it like Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays? How does that work for you?
It is jumbled together, but there is a part of it that's I would say the majority of like Mondays and Tuesdays is probably dedicated more to the network, and towards the end of the week I go more towards the research. But yeah, it's a jumble. I was doing field work in southern Mexico some months ago in March, and while I was there, I was on my cell phone, like out in the field as I'm digging. I would stop and look at my cell phone and answer a question to my administrative assistant about something in the budget, put my cell phone back in my pocket and keep digging. So, I mean,
that's great.
It was, yeah. So it's kind of constant everything, yeah.
Now, as manager, do you have direct reports? Is this essentially a one-man show?
Yeah, there's 20 some people in the network there. So yeah, it's not a one man show. We all make it happen. And I have 4 people who kind of work with more directly. And they have their own teams beneath them. But I'm still the one that has to make kind of the decisions on staffing, and we have a few positions open, for instance, right now. And so I'm the one that drafts the description of the position so we can put that online and look for job applicants and whatnot.
Is it a two-way street? In other words, are there aspects of your administrative duties that inform the research, and are there aspects of the research that are helpful in your administrative duties?
Yes, 100%. Both of those.
What's an example that illustrates the point?
I said, so going back, it's hard to say which way this goes. So the DAS that I mentioned, all this work, use that again as an example because it works really well. We can clearly see, so I'll take one step back. So the Caltech in general is always looking for the next thing, like what is the newest technology, what's the latest that we can apply here, try to always kind of to move the envelope. I think is part of the idea of Caltech's philosophy in general, and we certainly try to do that in the data center. And I certainly get it. That's what excites me. I mean, that's where I want. What can we do that's new? So the DAS is the newest thing. I mean, there's nothing newer. It's this new technology. There's all these different questions. How useful is it? Really revolutionary? Is it Is it just adding another headache? Like, is it actually something new? But that's what makes it exciting. It's the new thing, but it's also a ton of data, and so it's difficult to even deal with. But we can see it's the new thing, right? And so from a network perspective, I look at this and say like, oh, we need to start working with that and figure out how, because in the future we need to incorporate this into a network. And then looking at a kind of research side, I see that this is the volumes of data coming in. How is this going to be useful to a network? what's this additional information it can provide. And so I kind of flip back and forth on that same one, and I feel like I don't sit on either side of it. But John Nguyen and I are certainly, both working on it, I guess, from both perspectives constantly. He's definitely more on the research side, but I'm moving in that direction too. So I guess that's the easiest one that kind of bridges both.
Besides not having teaching responsibilities as research professors, is your day-to-day more or less the same as other faculty in the Seismo Lab in terms of the meetings you're going to, the things that you're involved in?
I think actually I'm quite a bit different. I'm not on any committees or anything else. I'm only the lab kind of, or the network takes up all my time. So it actually gets in the, that's not the right way to say it. So a lot of times I'm in meetings with the network and I'm not able to go to, say, talks or something that the rest of the faculty might be able to go to. So it takes up quite a bit of time. I would say somebody like Mark Simons might be the exception to what I just said, because he's also in a number of meetings with everything he's doing with NASA, for example. And so we just take on these other responsibilities. But certainly before, when I was just a professor, it wasn't just a professor. I also ran the department, did other things. So I was in a number of meetings, but there was a lot more of kind of just faculty meetings, and I don't have any faculty meetings as a research professor. Where
might the funding in terms of, your various jobs, the research professor, the manager of the network and things like that, what funding is coming from Caltech, from the Seismo Lab, and what's coming from the survey?
So everything for the network comes from the survey and from Cal OES. That's pretty much everything. A little bit from SCEC too. All my research funds. So I've gotten support from the Seismo Lab and also from NSF for all my personal research. Those are the only two. Also, I haven't even mentioned. There's this whole geothermal well research that we're doing for tremors in a geothermal well, and that funding's all come from a project with Jean-Philippe. So I guess collaborations, the Seismo Lab and NSF, I would say, from the research professor's side.
Finally, do you have opportunity to interact or supervise postdocs or graduate students?
Yes, I do. So I have 2 postdocs right now. I still, since I only moved from Mexico a year and a half ago, have a couple of grad students in Mexico. And I'm hoping, it looks like there might be another grad student now at Caltech that's joining my group.
And is that, as research professor and with all of your other duties, is that an expectation besides what you personally want to do, is building up a research group, having your own graduate students and postdocs? Is that very much within your expectations and aspirations at Caltech?
It's very much, yes, within my expectations, and it was within my aspirations. I think in general, I'm not expected to do as much as, say, like the academic professors, just because I don't, since I have the responsibility of the network, and I think that, the position was really kind of focused on the network previously. But I certainly have the freedom to do that, and as long as I have the time to do that.
Yeah. In terms of your interest and your expertise and your bandwidth, if a graduate student or a postdoc would want to work with you, would it be just as likely because of your academic expertise, the things that you've done research on, or is it more because of your involvement in the network and the archive?
If it's a student, I would say probably more on the research side. If it's a postdoc, it might be more the network. And the reason for that is I have funding for postdocs from the network. And so there's a natural kind of connection there, a way to kind of move things forward with a postdoc that I don't have with students. But the students seem to be more excited about the other research, we'll say. So far, I've only been here a year and a half, so we'll see what happens in the future.
We'll see what happens. Alan, this has been a terrific conversation. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground in under 90 minutes. Our next one, we'll go all the way back to the beginning, learn about your family background. We'll take the story right up to the present.